There is a particular kind of testimony that carries more weight than any general's briefing or any foreign ministry statement, and it comes from the men who were sent to the front lines as expendable material and somehow lived to talk about it. Former convicts recruited into Russia's penal assault formations, the units popularly known as Storm Z, have been among the most consistently honest narrators of this war, precisely because they have nothing left to protect. They were never part of the officer corps. They have no career to defend, no pension to lose, no Kremlin talking points to repeat on state television. When one of them says publicly that Russia has already lost the war, that statement deserves to be taken seriously, not because it is definitely true, but because it comes from someone who watched the war from its most brutal and least propagandized vantage point, the trench line and the assault group, where the gap between official narrative and lived reality is measured in corpses. The argument being made by these former fighters is not especially complicated, and that is part of what makes it compelling. It goes something like this. Continuing the war does not improve Russia's position. It worsens it. Every additional month of fighting burns through more soldiers, more armor, more artillery shells, more of the economic slack that has kept the wartime economy from collapsing outright. The longer the war continues, the weaker Russia's negotiating position becomes, not stronger. So the real choice facing Moscow is not between victory and defeat. Victory, in the sense of achieving the maximalist goals Vladimir Putin articulated at the outset, full control of 4 annexed regions, a compliant government in Kiev, a demilitarized and neutralized Ukraine, is no longer on the table, and arguably never was. The real choice is between a bad deal now and a worse deal later. Capitulation today, on relatively survivable terms, or capitulation 18 months from now, after the front has degraded further, after the economy has taken more damage, after more of the country's young men have been fed into the meat grinder, on terms that will be significantly harsher. This is a genuinely bleak thesis, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment before moving to the counter-arguments, because it reflects something real about the psychology of a certain segment of the Russian population that has direct experience of the war rather than experiencing it through state television. There is a fatalism here, an acceptance that the war was lost some time ago, and that all the fighting since then has simply been about negotiating the size of the loss. The former prisoner's specific framing, that the opportunity for a gentler outcome existed roughly a year earlier and was allowed to slip away, implies a kind of rolling deadline where each missed opportunity for negotiated settlement forecloses a slightly better version of peace and opens the door to a slightly worse one. If that logic holds, then Russia today is negotiating from a weaker position than it held in mid-2025, and it will be negotiating from a weaker position still in 2027, whenever the war eventually ends. It is important to be clear about what this argument is and is not. It is not a claim that Ukraine is on the verge of expelling Russian forces from all occupied territory, and it is not a claim that Russia's military is on the brink of collapse. It is a much narrower claim about trajectory, about the second derivative of the war rather than its current position. The claim is that the trend line is unfavorable to Russia and has been for some time, and that continuing to fight simply extends the period over which that unfavorable trend compounds. Whether that assessment is correct is a matter of genuine dispute among analysts, and reasonable people looking at the same battlefield data reach different conclusions. But the fact that a man who fought in one of Russia's most expendable combat formations is willing to say this publicly and frame the acknowledgement of defeat as something almost mundane, nothing to be ashamed of, is itself a data point about the state of morale and expectation among at least some segment of Russian combatants. There's also something notable in the specific language used, the idea that Russia faced a choice between shame and continued war, and ended up with both defeat and the burden of survival. This is not the language of Kremlin propaganda, which continues to frame the invasion as an existential defensive struggle against NATO encirclement and Ukrainian aggression, a narrative still repeated on Russian state channels on a nightly basis. It is the language of someone who has stepped outside that framing entirely and is now speaking in essentially Western journalistic terms, discussing the war as a strategic error with cascading costs, a war that will burden not just this generation of Russians, but their children as well. That intergenerational framing matters because it points to something beyond the immediate battlefield situation. The recognition that the sanctions regime, the diplomatic isolation, the demographic damage from hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded young men, and the reputational damage to Russia as a great power will not simply evaporate the day a ceasefire is signed. These are structural costs that will shape Russian society, economy, and international standing for years, arguably decades, regardless of how the war formally concludes. Now, alongside that grim internal Russian narrative, there is the entirely separate question of how this war is being covered and interpreted in Western media, and here things get considerably more complicated, because there is a persistent gap between the tone of coverage and the underlying uncertainty of the war's actual trajectory. Western outlets have extensively covered Ukraine's escalating campaign of long-range drone and missile strikes deep into Russian territory, and the images are genuinely dramatic. Late June brought some of the most intense strikes yet on Moscow's oil refining infrastructure, with the Moscow oil refinery, one of the largest fuel suppliers for the entire capital region, and located only a few miles from the Kremlin itself, hit multiple times within the space of roughly 2 weeks. Plumes of thick black smoke over the Russian capital made for striking television and social media footage, and Ukrainian officials, including President Zelensky, explicitly framed these strikes as a message to the Russian public and to Vladimir Putin personally that the war has real costs that can no longer be confined to the front line hundreds of miles away. The refinery itself is not a minor target. It is one of Russia's largest fuel processing facilities and accounts for a substantial share of the fuel supply for the Moscow region specifically. Repeated strikes against it, on top of a broader pattern of Ukrainian attacks against oil depots, rail infrastructure, and command and logistics nodes deeper inside Russia, do represent a real operational achievement for Ukraine's long-range strike programs, which have matured considerably over the past 2 years, from a scattered, improvised capability into something resembling a systematic campaign against Russian energy and logistics infrastructure. Ukrainian officials have been increasingly willing to publicize the distances involved in these strikes, in some cases describing attacks launched from many hundreds of kilometers inside Ukrainian-controlled territory, which is itself a signal intended for both domestic and international audiences, proof that Ukraine retains meaningful offensive reach, even after more than 4 years of grinding attritional warfare along a mostly static front line. The problem with how much of this gets covered in the West is not that the events themselves are exaggerated. The strikes happened, the refinery burned, the flights out of Moscow were genuinely disrupted, and Russian officials themselves, through statements from the Moscow mayor and regional governors, confirmed damage, casualties, and significant disruption. The problem is more about the interpretive leap that regularly gets made from these tactical successes to sweeping strategic conclusions. A burning refinery is newsworthy and visually compelling in a way that, say, a stable front line grinding along through attritional infantry assaults simply is not. So there is a structural bias in coverage toward events that produce dramatic footage, even when those events may not be decisive in the broader arc of the war. Every successful strike gets extensive coverage. The vastly more numerous strikes that get intercepted, and there are hundreds of interceptions on both sides most nights, get comparatively little attention because intercepted drones don't produce compelling video. This creates a recurring pattern in Western commentary where individual tactical events, however significant on their own terms, get elevated into evidence for much larger claims. That the war has decisively turned in Ukraine's favor, that Vladimir Putin's political position is now critically unstable, that popular discontent inside Russia is approaching some kind of tipping point. These are much bigger claims than the underlying evidence. A burning refinery and a disrupted travel schedule at one airport can actually support on their own. It is entirely possible for Ukraine's long-range strike campaign to be effective, imposing real economic and logistical costs on Russia, without that campaign being sufficient by itself to produce Putin's political downfall or a decisive shift in the war's outcome. Those are two separate questions, and conflating them serves an emotionally satisfying narrative more than it serves an accurate one. It's also worth being honest about the asymmetry in how the two sides' actions get covered. Russian strikes against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, energy grids, apartment buildings, hospitals, occur with comparable or greater frequency and have inflicted a much larger civilian toll over the course of the war. But by this stage of the conflict, they receive comparatively routine, almost perfunctory coverage in much of the Western press, treated as an expected and recurring feature of Russian strategy, rather than as a special or newsworthy event in its own right. Ukrainian strikes against Russian military, industrial, and energy targets, by contrast, tend to be framed as evidence of momentum, of a war finally turning, of Kiev seizing the initiative. Both sides are launching hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles at each other on many nights, and both sides intercept the overwhelming majority of them. The framing difference says at least as much about what Western audiences want to believe about the war's trajectory as it does about the underlying military reality. None of this is to dismiss the genuinely significant testimony from Ukraine's top military leadership about how the character of the fighting has shifted. In a substantial television interview given at the end of June, Ukraine's commander-in-chief laid out a detailed picture of how Russian offensive operations have contracted over the past year. According to his account, Russian forces had been attempting offensive operations along roughly 13 distinct axes earlier in the war, and that number has now fallen to around 7, with only a handful of those representing genuinely intense contested sectors. His explanation for this contraction centers on logistics rather than manpower alone. Ukraine's sustained campaign against Russian rail lines, fuel depots, ammunition storage, and command infrastructure deep behind the front has measurably reduced the flow of troops, equipment, and supplies reaching frontline units. Russian forces, he argued, have become less mobile and less capable of shifting reserves quickly between sectors, which forces Russian commanders to concentrate their diminishing offensive capacity into a smaller number of locations rather than maintaining pressure across the entire front simultaneously. He also offered a specific statistic that roughly 45 to 50% of tactical engagements along the line of contact are now being initiated by Ukrainian forces rather than Russian ones, which is a meaningful shift if accurate, though it should be read carefully. He was explicit that this does not mean Ukraine has seized the strategic initiative across the theater as a whole. Russia remains, by his own account, on a strategic offensive, still attempting to expand its territorial control, still committing manpower and equipment to that goal. What has changed, in his telling, is the tempo and the geography of the fighting. Russian offensive activity has become less continuous and less overwhelming, while Ukrainian forces have gained enough breathing room in certain sectors to conduct their own localized counterattacks and probing operations, dictating the tempo of combat in specific pockets, even while remaining broadly on the strategic defensive elsewhere. The claimed recapture of territory, several hundred square kilometers since the start of the year according to Ukrainian military statistics, is presented as supporting evidence for this narrative of eroding Russian offensive capacity. This is a real and measurable claim, though, as with most territorial statistics in this war, it should be treated with appropriate caution rather than accepted uncritically. Both sides have strong incentives to present territorial control in the most favorable light possible, and independent verification of exact frontline positions, especially in contested or rapidly changing sectors, is often difficult, relying on open-source satellite imagery analysis, geolocated combat footage, and other indirect methods that can lag actual battlefield conditions by days or weeks. That several hundred square kilometers have changed hands is plausible and consistent with independent open-source tracking efforts, but the significance of that figure needs context. Ukraine's territory recaptured represents a very small fraction of the roughly one-fifth of the country still under Russian occupation. It indicates that Russian advances have slowed and, in places, reversed, not that a broader battlefield turning point has been reached. It's also worth noting that Ukraine's own military leadership, even while describing this relatively favorable shift in tempo, has been consistently careful not to claim the war is close to ending or that Ukraine now holds a decisive advantage. The same commander who described the contraction in Russian offensive axes also spoke about continuing to prepare for renewed Russian offensive activity, including the possibility of new axes of attack from Russian territory into currently quieter sectors of the front, with specific concern about a scenario involving an offensive launched from Russia's Bryansk region toward Ukraine's Chernihiv region in the north. This is a notably more cautious framing than what often gets amplified in Western press coverage. Ukraine's own military leadership is describing a war of attrition that has shifted somewhat in Ukraine's favor in specific respects: logistics disruption, a reduced Russian offensive tempo, modest territorial gains, while explicitly warning that Russia retains the capacity to open new fronts and that the war remains far from resolved. That is a meaningfully different picture from the more triumphalist tone found in some Western headlines built around individual strike footage. This brings us to perhaps the most consequential and most speculative claim circulating in Western commentary. The idea that a Russia facing what commentators describe as a humiliating defeat might respond with the use of tactical nuclear weapons, potentially even against small NATO member states that have been particularly vocal supporters of Ukraine, including the Baltic republics. This is an extraordinarily serious scenario to raise, and it deserves to be treated with real caution rather than either dismissed out of hand or treated as an imminent likelihood. There is no reliable public evidence at this time indicating that Russia is preparing for such a strike. And Russian nuclear doctrine, as publicly stated, reserves the use of nuclear weapons for scenarios involving existential threats to the Russian state itself or attacks using weapons of mass destruction against Russia, not for battlefield setbacks in a conventional war, however serious those setbacks might be. Russian officials, including Putin himself, have periodically used nuclear rhetoric as a signaling tool throughout the war, generally timed to discourage specific Western decisions about weapons transfers or expanded support for Ukraine, rather than as genuine indications of imminent escalation. That said, it would be equally irresponsible to declare the scenario impossible. Nuclear risk in this war has never been zero, and a cornered leadership facing what it perceives as an existential threat to the regime, rather than merely to territorial gains in Ukraine, is a genuinely more dangerous actor than one operating from a position of relative strength. The appropriate response to this uncertainty is neither panic nor complacency, but recognition that the scenario exists on a spectrum of possibility that is difficult to quantify with any precision, and that most serious defense analysts continue to regard direct nuclear use against NATO territory as a low-probability event, even under conditions of significant battlefield reversal, precisely because such an act would guarantee a response that would end any prospect of regime survival, the very outcome Russian leadership would be trying to avoid. Western governments have, for their part, continued to calibrate their support for Ukraine with this risk in mind, which is one reason the pace and scope of Western weapons transfers has often lagged behind what Ukrainian officials have requested. Stepping back from the individual claims, what emerges is a war that resists simple narratives in either direction. It is not accurate to say Russia is winning in any straightforward sense. The pattern described by Ukraine's own military leadership of contracting offensive axes, reduced tempo, and logistic strain is consistent with independent assessments from Western intelligence services and open-source analysts over the past year. Russian forces have continued to make grinding, extremely costly territorial gains in certain sectors, particularly around Pokrovsk and other contested towns in Donetsk region, but at a pace and cost that most serious analysts describe as unsustainable over the medium to long term without some combination of expanded mobilization, deeper economic strain, or negotiated pause. Nor is it accurate to say Ukraine is winning in any decisive sense. Ukraine remains heavily dependent on continued Western military and financial support, faces its own serious manpower constraints and mobilization challenges, and has not demonstrated the capacity to retake large amounts of occupied territory through conventional offensive operations, relying instead on a strategy of attrition, defense, and long-range strikes intended to degrade Russian capacity over time, rather than achieve rapid territorial liberation. What the evidence does support is a war that has become significantly more static and attritional in its ground component, while becoming considerably more dynamic and consequential in its deep strike component. Both sides have invested heavily in long-range drone and missile technology, and both sides are now capable of inflicting real, visible damage against targets far from the front line that would have been essentially unreachable earlier in the war. This deep strike war is arguably where the most significant developments of the past year have occurred, more so than shifts in the ground war itself. Ukraine's ability to repeatedly strike major refining and energy infrastructure near Moscow represents a genuine and growing capability, one that imposes real economic costs on Russia's ability to sustain its war effort, and that carries a political signal to the Russian public that the war's costs are not confined to soldiers at the front. Russia, for its part, continues to conduct large-scale strikes against Ukrainian energy infrastructure and civilian targets, inflicting substantial damage and casualties on a rolling basis, a pattern that has continued largely unabated throughout the war, regardless of shifts in ground combat. The question of whether Vladimir Putin's political position is genuinely precarious is one where Western commentary often runs ahead of the available evidence. Putin has weathered numerous predictions of imminent political crisis over the course of this war, dating back to the earliest and most difficult months of the invasion, through the Wagner mutiny in 2023, through repeated waves of sanctions, through battlefield setbacks around Kharkiv and Kherson, and through sustained economic pressure that has nonetheless not produced the kind of visible internal political challenge that many analysts predicted at various points. This does not mean his position is invulnerable or that internal pressures are not real and accumulating. Sanctions have imposed genuine costs on the Russian economy, though Russia has adapted more successfully than many initially expected, rerouting energy exports, developing parallel import networks, and maintaining a wartime fiscal posture that has so far avoided full economic collapse. Casualties, which by various independent estimates now run well into the hundreds of thousands of dead and wounded, represent a real demographic and social cost that Russian society is absorbing, largely through recruitment from economically marginal regions and populations, prisoners, contract soldiers drawn by signing bonuses that have grown substantial by Russian standards, and ethnic minority regions that have supplied disproportionate numbers of frontline troops relative to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Whether accumulating strikes on Russian territory, rising casualties, and economic strain eventually produce a genuine internal political crisis for Putin is one of the genuinely open questions of this war. An honest analysis should acknowledge that nobody, inside or outside Russia, can predict this with confidence. The testimony from former Storm Z fighters that the war is already lost, that continuing it only compounds the damage, may reflect a broader current of opinion among Russians who have had direct exposure to the war's brutal realities, but it is difficult to know how representative that sentiment is of Russian public opinion more broadly, particularly given the constraints on independent polling and free expression inside Russia, and given that state media continues to dominate the information environment for the large majority of the population that does not seek out alternative sources. It is also worth considering what a negotiated end to this war might actually look like. Given everything described above, since that is ultimately the question underlying both the former prisoner's pessimistic assessment and the broader Western debate about Ukraine's trajectory. Most serious negotiating frameworks discussed by diplomats and analysts over the past year have converged on some version of a ceasefire along roughly the current line of contact, with unresolved questions of formal territorial recognition, security guarantees for Ukraine, sanctions relief for Russia, and the treatment of frozen Russian assets left to future negotiation rather than resolved at the point of a ceasefire itself. Whether such an arrangement, however unsatisfying it might be to either side's maximalist goals, represents the gentler option the former Storm Z fighter referenced, or whether it represents merely a pause before renewed conflict, is impossible to say with certainty. Ceasefires and protracted territorial conflicts have historically had a mixed record of holding, and any agreement reached under current conditions would likely leave enormous unresolved grievances on both sides. There's also the question of timing and international context that shapes how much leverage either side actually has heading into any negotiation. Diplomatic engagement involving the United States has continued in fits and starts throughout this period, with American envoys periodically shuttling between capitals in an effort to broker some kind of framework agreement, even as the pace of that engagement has been inconsistent and has not yet produced a durable breakthrough. European allies, for their part, have continued to signal support for Ukraine at successive summits, though the durability and scale of that support, particularly as it pertains to sustained weapons production and financing over multiple additional years of war, remains a subject of real uncertainty and internal political debate within NATO member states. Ukraine's own domestic political situation, including ongoing questions about mobilization policy, war fatigue, and the durability of public support for continued resistance rather than negotiated settlement, adds another layer of uncertainty to any assessment of how this conflict is likely to conclude. Taken together, what all of this suggests is a war in a genuinely ambiguous phase, one where individual events, a burning refinery, a battlefield statistic about engagement initiation, a pessimistic statement from a former penal unit fighter, are all real and all worth taking seriously, but none of which by itself settles the larger question of where this conflict is heading or how it will ultimately be resolved. The most intellectually honest position available right now is one of calibrated uncertainty. Russian offensive momentum has genuinely slowed, and Ukraine's long-range strike capability has genuinely grown more effective. Both real and verifiable developments, but claims of a decisive strategic turning point, of Putin's imminent political collapse, or of a war rapidly approaching its conclusion, whether through Russian capitulation or through Ukrainian battlefield triumph, remain considerably ahead of what the available evidence can actually support. The testimony of men who fought and were captured or who survived Russia's most expendable combat formations offers a valuable and often underappreciated window into the psychological and material toll this war has exacted on ordinary Russians sent to fight it, a toll that persists and compounds regardless of how the broader strategic picture eventually resolves itself, and regardless of which side's media narrative proves closer to the eventual truth. There is also an economic dimension to all of this that rarely gets the same attention as the dramatic footage of burning refineries, but that may, in the end, matter more for how the war concludes than any single battlefield event. Russia's wartime economy has proven considerably more resilient than many analysts predicted in the opening months of the invasion, adapting to sanctions through a combination of parallel import networks, expanded trade relationships with countries willing to continue purchasing Russian energy, and a so-called shadow fleet of tankers used to move oil outside the reach of the Western price cap regime. At the same time, that resilience has come at a real and growing cost. Russia's central bank has had to maintain extremely high interest rates to manage inflation driven by wartime spending. Labor shortages have intensified as men are pulled from the civilian economy into military service or war-related industry, and the long-term productive capacity of the Russian economy, its ability to attract investment, develop new industries, and maintain technological competitiveness outside of the military-industrial sector, has arguably been mortgaged for the sake of sustaining the war effort in the near term. Repeated strikes against refining capacity of the kind seen in the attacks on the Moscow facility compound this pressure directly, since refined fuel is not simply an export commodity, but something the domestic economy, including agriculture, logistics, and ordinary civilian transportation, depends on as well. Sustained damage to refining capacity therefore has a dual effect, denting export revenue while simultaneously creating domestic fuel supply problems that are considerably harder for the Kremlin to hide from ordinary Russians than casualty figures from a front line hundreds of miles from Moscow. It is worth situating this current moment within the broader arc of the war, rather than treating it as an isolated development. This is now a conflict well into its 5th year, and it has moved through several distinct phases that are useful to keep in mind when evaluating claims about a decisive turning point. The initial phase involved a rapid, overextended Russian invasion that failed to achieve its most ambitious objectives, including the capture of Kiev, within the first weeks of fighting. A subsequent phase saw significant Ukrainian counteroffensives recapture substantial territory in the Kharkiv and Kherson regions during the latter half of 2022. This was followed by a long period of largely static, grinding attritional warfare through 2023 and 2024, punctuated by extremely costly Russian offensives that yielded territorial gains measured in the low hundreds of square kilometers at a time, at a human cost that Western intelligence assessments have periodically described as historically severe relative to the ground actually gained. Throughout each of these phases, Western commentary has periodically declared turning points, moments when the war was said to be decisively shifting in one direction or another. And in retrospect, many of those declared turning points look considerably more modest than they were portrayed at the time. This pattern of overinterpreting individual developments is not a reason to dismiss the current wave of commentary about Ukraine's long-range strike campaign and the reported contraction in Russian offensive axes, both of which appear to reflect genuine and verifiable shifts. But it is a reason for appropriate caution before concluding that this particular moment is fundamentally different from the several previous moments that were also described in similarly dramatic terms. The information war surrounding this conflict deserves its own consideration, separate from the battlefield realities it purports to describe. Both Ukraine and Russia have strong incentives to shape international and domestic perceptions of the war's trajectory, and both governments have become considerably more sophisticated over 4 years at managing the release of footage, statistics, and statements intended to support their preferred narrative. Ukrainian officials have clear incentives to emphasize successful long-range strikes and battlefield statistics favorable to Ukraine's position, both to sustain domestic morale after years of hardship and to reinforce the case for continued Western military and financial support at a moment when that support cannot be taken for granted, given shifting political dynamics in donor countries. Russian officials, for their part, have incentives to minimize the visible impact of strikes on Russian territory, downplay casualty figures, and maintain a public narrative of steady, if slow, progress toward Russia's stated objectives. Independent verification of many specific claims, whether about territory recaptured, drones intercepted, or damage inflicted on specific facilities, is often difficult and relies heavily on open-source intelligence analysts working from satellite imagery, geolocated video, and other indirect evidence that can take days or weeks to confirm or refute initial claims made by either side. A careful listener or reader should therefore treat single-source claims from either government and single dramatic images circulating on social media with a degree of skepticism proportional to how neatly they fit the preferred narrative of whichever side is publicizing them. None of this uncertainty should be read as an argument for indifference to how the war concludes, or as suggesting that the human costs being described by the former prisoner reflecting on his own participation in a war he now considers unwinnable, by residents of Moscow suburbs dealing with drone debris landing on their homes, by Ukrainian families in Sumy and elsewhere absorbing nightly missile and drone barrages, are somehow less real for being difficult to fit into a tidy strategic narrative. They are entirely real, and they will continue to accumulate for as long as the war continues, regardless of which side's media coverage proves more accurate in hindsight. What careful analysis can offer, in the absence of certainty about how or when this war ends, is a clearer sense of what is actually known versus what is being inferred or hoped for by commentators on either side of the information war. Russian offensive tempo has genuinely slowed and become geographically constrained. Ukrainian long-range strikes have genuinely grown more frequent, more precise, and more damaging to Russian energy infrastructure. Casualties on both sides remain severe and are being absorbed by societies that have adapted in different ways to sustaining a war of this duration. And the ultimate resolution, whether through negotiated settlement, prolonged stalemate, or some form of decisive military development that has not yet occurred, remains genuinely unpredictable, shaped by military, economic, and political factors that extend well beyond any single week's headlines about a burning refinery or a soldier's public confession that the war his country started has already been lost